Essa música.
Hello, I am Aisha.
And Paula, your cultural hybrid mental health therapist.
Here to explore unfiltered and heartfelt conversations on core issues
that affect us as human beings. Get ready for honest, captivating,
and real stories that take you on a journey to navigate your life
in the best possible way.
So grab a seat
and stay with us on this episode of
Do We Have Your Attention? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Do We Have Your Attention podcast. My name is Aisha, and with me is the amazing
Paula.
And I'm so excited today, but also sad, because this is the finale for season 1. Wow.
Can we just take that in?
Yes.
Once upon a time, we were two girls who had a dream.
Oh, God.
Years and years and years and years ago. And now our dream.
I'm sorry for
our
laughing,
dream
but yes.
has a season 1 finale.
Wow. I'm so proud of you, girl.
I'm so proud of you too.
Thank you.
We should actually be taking that in. We're always telling our listeners to check in with themselves. So if it's okay, let's actually check in with ourselves.
Okay. I'm feeling excited, proud, happy. I'm feeling very green and yellow today, but I'm also feeling sad that, this has become routine for our recordings.
Yes.
And we just know that at specific times in the month, like, we're going to see each other and talk and also record. So, yeah. But how about you? How are you feeling?
Yes. I like what you said too as well. Like, it's become routine, and not routine in a bad way, but just more so something that you're looking forward to doing. Even though, yes, there's some huffing and puffing that happens when you have a busy weekend. You're like, oh gosh, I have to record. But then we end up coming here and recording, and I'm like, oh, where did all my exhaustion go? Where did it go to?
I know.
But no, I'm feeling excited. I'm feeling happy. I'm feeling proud. But most of all, I'm feeling grateful, because obviously you and I know personally the back end conversations that we've had over the years of this is something that we're going to do. So just kind of looking back at the fact that we are officially podcast hosts. Well, we've already been since the beginning, but with actual body of work, season 1 body of work.
We actually have season 1. That's crazy. Yes, you're right about gratitude. Shout out to the one person up there, God.
Thank you, God. Thank you,
God. Thank you to Paula. Thank you to me. Thank you to our amazing producers.
Yes.
For always dealing with our stressful recording.
Shout out, Kyra.
And shout out
and our amazing engineer.
Yeah. shout out to you guys. Yeah, very grateful, very exciting. Well, we're ending season 1 by discussing something incredibly important, which is existential burnout.
I love this topic.
Yeah, I know. And I know we jumped into our feelings checking, but I just want to say this real quick. As always, we're encouraging our listeners to take a second to check in with themselves. How you feeling? If life has been a little bit overwhelming or like it's lost its meaning, this episode, I think, would resonate with you, and we hope that you could take something away from it.
Absolutely. I agree, because we'll be exploring the many faces of existential burnout, what triggers it, how it affects different parts of our lives, and most importantly, how can we actually begin to find our way out of it.
Yes, and without further ado, I'm going to ask you, Paula, my very lovely host, how would you define existential burnout, and in what ways does it stand apart from the burnout we typically hear, or traditional burnout about work or like our daily lives?
I did not even think about it like that, which is very interesting when you say how it differs from traditional burnout. And I think to some degree, obviously, burnout is just like a state of complete exhaustion, emotionally, physically, mentally.
Yeah.
And it starts to affect your quality of life and your daily functioning to a point where it's hard for you to ignore it. So that's what burnout is, right? Now, when we add existential, when I think existential, I think more so from a perspective of just human existence. Like what it is to be human. And that's it's a good topic for us to have, because it's like the premise of our podcast of really talking about shared human experiences. shared human experiences and just how we can really navigate the world in a healthier way for ourselves.
Yeah.
I see that burnout, existential burnout, as pretty much burnout from a shared human experience. If you put it that way, where a collective is like a collective burnout.
Yeah.
It's a shared human burnout, experience burnout, so to speak. Because when we think about things like the pandemic, one of the big things that a lot of people talked about in the pandemic was the notion of it being collective trauma.
Yep.
Meaning it was a shared human experience. To some degree, people were affected. And you know how trauma in many different cases can be mild to moderate to severe in the sense where it impacts people very differently. Some people it's mildly, some people it's moderately, some people it's severely.
Yeah.
But it's still a collective experience. It's still a shared human experience.
Agreed.
I see existential burnout the exact same way as well.
Yeah.
Where it affects a lot of people mildly, moderately, severely too as well. What are your thoughts about that?
That's a good way of putting it. I'm so glad you brought the pandemic as an example because that's something that we did all collectively experience. Like just trying to find meaning of this thing that we're experiencing that not a lot of people have ever experienced. I know there are some previous generations that experienced something like that. But for us, let me just use my generation as an example, trying to figure out what is this? What is going on? How do I make sense of this? But also like, what is my view of the world now with this experience? So I think like just what you said, it's like this fatigue from looking for meaning and purpose in your daily experiences. And I think it can affect your personal identity, your relationship with people, your actions, your behaviors. And I think that's just how I would put it. Your spirituality too, you know, sometimes it could affect your spirituality.
You know, everything. When we talk about wheel of life, from social, I know we had a flashback from that's our inside joke. When we talk about wheel of life, or if we want to put it this way, we can also call it, I think there's to some degree like aspects of self-care, where we look at the mental aspect, we look at the emotional aspect, we look at the physical aspect, we look at the environmental aspect, we look at the spiritual aspect, we look at the recreational aspect, we look at the social aspect too as well. So that level of burnout really makes you, and I like what you said about fatigue from looking for meaning in life, and that collective fatigue to some degree starts impacting all these areas of whether it's our wheel of life or pillars of self-care. I want to ask what factors, and I know we're already kind of touching on it, but what factors or life experiences tend to actually contribute to someone feeling existentially burnt out? Could it be tied to societal pressures? Could it be tied to cultural pressures? Or personal challenges?
Honestly, I think it could be tied to all three. First of all, societal and cultural pressures can be an important reason why people experience existential burnout. I think in a lot of societies, there's this emphasis on achievement and success and productivity. But the funny part is there's a way that society kind of paints what success should look like. So if you don't fit, if it's looking like it's not going to fit those societal expectations, you can start to feel like a failure. You can start to feel like you're not accomplishing what you're supposed to be accomplishing. It can make you feel like you're not achieving your goals, or like there's something that you need to consistently strive for, even though you're doing your best and there's things that you could be proud of yourself for, right? And I also think that with societal pressures comes that fulfillment should only come with material things or possessions of those material things. And just like the idea of happiness comes from, there's a specific way they paint success. I don't know what it is, but I mean, I know what it is. It's like you're living in a big house, you are driving a Ferrari, you're driving a Lamborghini, you have like millions of dollars or pounds in your account. And when it's looking like you're not going to achieve those things, right? You start to question the purpose of your current career path, or like just your meaning of life, a directionless period. And I also think that for cultural norms and expectations, for example, marriage, having kids, career progression. If you feel like, and I'm going to be very specific for the Nigerian culture, because these are things that people say to me as well. They're like, oh, you're nearing 30, you don't have a husband, you don't have children. What's going on? And I think that sometimes people can categorize that as a sense of failure. Like, oh, I'm nearing 30 now. I'm nearing 35. I'm not married. I don't have kids. So what does this mean? A lot of people feel like they are falling behind, or like there's a timeline to achieve these things. And it can create anxiety and a crisis of identity for real. And that's how you see so many people kind of lowering their standards, or just kind of impulsively engaging in relationships that doesn't serve them in the long term. But also social media. Should we add that?
Absolutely.
And I've been a victim of social media making me have existential burnout, because I'll be looking. It's so easy to compare your life by looking at the life that someone has curated to look perfect on social media. And again, what they curate is like what I was saying earlier about the societal expectations of what success should look like. So if I'm looking at someone's post, I'm looking at multiple posts, I'm like, all of these people have achieved these things, though. Some of them are younger than me. Some of them are like around the same age. It starts to make, for example, in my experience, like when I've experienced it, just like a sense of inadequacy, or a sense that I'm not doing enough. There has to be more. There has to be more. There has to be more. And just hearing stories of people making 6 to 8 figures, 10, 11 figures. And I'm looking at myself, I'm like, I'm working my ass to get there. And some people are just, this is just what comes with their career paths, right? So you could give this sense of anxiety again, leading to making me question, what is the meaning behind the life I'm living, this career path I'm choosing? What would that look like if I do want to settle down, you know, and make some of these aspects of my life that I want to create for myself? What about you? What do you think?
Absolutely. Like, you really, really hit the nail on the head when thinking about what factors or life experiences tend to contribute to existentially feeling burnt out. Because I've been really trying to figure out what is different. Because I think to a large degree, generations also before us, or even just conversation, a lot of people are sort of wondering, like, what exactly is actually different? Like, why are millennials so angry, so lazy, so burnt out? By the way, I'm just referring to what people have said. I'm not saying that this is what I necessarily believe. Or Gen Z. Why are these generations sort of reacting in the way in which they are? We don't necessarily understand it. But if we're saying that to a large extent, societal, cultural pressures have always been there. And always existed in some shape or form. So what is actually really different that is making that pressure not just exist, but honestly contribute to a very different kind of existential feeling of burnout that I don't necessarily know if, at least I'm aware of, that generations of people have experienced in the way in which we're experiencing it today. And I can't help but honestly think about two things. One, the pandemic, if I'm being real with you.
True.
That's one. And I'll explain why I say that. But then the other factor also being social media. So that's why when you said, should I say social media? I was like, yeah. And not just necessarily social media from a perspective of apps and whatnot. We're talking about this new, this digital age of consumption, basically. And not really having any levels of boundaries within our consumption, having levels of discipline within our consumption. Not the days where before us to watch something on TV, we would actually have to wait for the time it airs for us to be able to watch.
Now everything's
as
online.
Opposed to you and I talking just earlier on about Love is Blind and like, oh, I want to watch it, I want to do that, I want to do that. All the many things that are sort of accessible to us and in our faces. And I think sometimes when we think accessibility, we think like, okay, so that's privilege. It's a good thing. So if we're saying it's a good thing, why are people struggling so much to navigate it to a point where it might actually be causing some level of existential burnout? And I think to a large degree, these two factors honestly have been the difference in what is happening. Now with COVID, this is just my own, the thoughts and the questions I ask myself late at night when I'm supposed to be sleeping. In really trying to understand.
Deep reflection.
We talked about it being a collective trauma and shared human experience, right? One of the things that I really noticed, of course, there was a spike in mental health issues.
Agreed.
Mental health challenges.
Agreed.
A spike in social anxiety and anxiety symptoms. A spike as well in just a lot more dysfunctional habits of living.
Yeah.
And a lot of people can easily just go, we blame the pandemic. The pandemic is the one that caused all of these things.
Yeah.
But I think the premise of what's happened, of what it meant to be isolated in most cases, be isolated and being in lockdown I would say for a number of people, because it's different for different people.
Agreed.
But for a large number of people was either a positive thing for people who had already been really dealing with dysfunction in everyday life, feeling very overwhelmed, but just the burnout that we experience on a day-to-day basis. But then, of course, the other aspect of this is it revealed a lot of unresolved issues and challenges a lot of us have probably been able to survive through in life. And then you sort of have to, one, sit with it. Sit with it, but then also the fear that you could be the next person who could get this thing that could kill you. So it's like, oh wait,
stressful.
Unresolved stuff is coming up. Then there's also fight or flight because we were fight or flight mode in the pandemic. So to a large degree, a lot of unresolved mental health challenges that a lot of us were experiencing started to come out. Now, pandemic to some degree ended. Now, what do we now do with it?
Ended.
What do we do with all of these things that we're starting to see that was unresolved, but we're able to sort of suppress and survive through? Now we're like, oh crap, like how do I actually navigate what life now looks like? Because if they're saying this is a new normal, and then we add the factor of social media, like you said, where there is an idealistic view of what life looks like, what the world looks like today, what success looks like, what joy looks like. And you start measuring and comparing, to a large degree, you're going to consistently feel like you're failing. You're going to consistently feel like you're exhausted. You're going to consistently feel as though there is nothing. I'm sort of trying to live up to this idealistic expectation. And I'm just constantly being overwhelmed and beaten down. So in my own long-winded explanation, these are some of the two things I think to a large degree is causing that difference in why there's so much experience of existential burnout that we cannot really explain.
I agree. And I'm so glad you used the pandemic as an example, because that's when a lot of people had the big questions of life. You know, what is the meaning of life? What does this mean that we're experiencing this? What is the purpose? Why am I here? And like you said, some people were able to channel that. And a lot of people were able to use the pandemic as a source of like success in their lives now. Like a lot of people are successful from just channeling that into like their interests and stuff. But there's a lot of people that greatly suffer from that, just not having that life routine that they built for themselves, or having to recreate whatever that routine would look like. Because it is exhausting. It takes a level of strength for you to be able to bring yourself out of being isolated the way we were. So those big questions of life can contribute to feeling existentially burnt out. And just to follow up with what we're talking about, what different areas do these existential burnout show up for us? And do you think it affects how we approach our careers, our relationships, or even how we see ourselves?
Yeah, I think that you pretty much answered that in the sense where the areas of our lives that it typically affects is pretty much relationships, career. It affects our community too as well. It affects our mental health, our emotional health, our physical health, our spiritual health as well, because it puts us in a position where we almost have to be a lot more intentional and a lot more active and maybe to some degree proactive in maintaining these aspects of our lives. And if you think about what we said burnout is at the very beginning, is that burnout to a large degree is exhaustion.
It's exhausting.
So we're saying existentially exhausted. And you're now telling me that I now have to be intentional about the relationships and nurturing. The career path, because I remember a client of mine telling me that their career option had changed to healthcare because they started to realize that in healthcare, they would always have a job. And if not for something like the pandemic, it did not
click.
really shed light.
Right.
Now, whereas somebody else might say their career path, it moved away from healthcare because of what they had to experience.
Right.
What they had to experience and what they were exposed to.
Yeah.
And to some degree, it made them consistently ask themselves these existential questions. And they're like, no. YOLO. I'm going to be a travel blogger and fashion blogger and living my best life.
I'm going to be baking in my house, period.
So to some degree, and I loved what you said earlier on about the fact that in some cases, the burnout has been a positive experience, or rather, these shared human experiences have led to a positive outcome, whereas in some other cases, it doesn't necessarily do that.
Yeah.
But I would say in terms of the different areas, one that obviously sticks out a lot for me is relationships. I think to a large degree, there's a level of disconnectedness that we are experiencing in our world today, and just isolation. That is a little scary, because
really
for me, the two things that I think about when I think of what does it mean to be human is to be able to feel and have emotions.
Right.
But then the second thing is connectedness. So if we're sort of losing the very thing and factor that creates that essence of what our existence is, of course, we're going to be feeling low. Of course, we're going to be exhausted. Of course, we're not necessarily going to have like an overall satisfaction with our lives. And I think to a large degree, we have to also tread very lightly with a topic like this, because a lot of people are just in a place of very black and white thinking. And I know, of course, that where you find a lot of those thinking patterns too as well in real life, but also on social media. Whereas I'm at a point in my life where if I don't feel like texting anybody back, I will go 2 months, ghost you, because I'm so tired and I have to deal with my own life and I'm very overwhelmed. And then some people will go, wow, that is so insensitive. How can you do that? Don't you know people care about you? And then you see some people also in the comments kind of going and saying, yes, even me too. I don't care anymore about responding to anybody. Blah, blah, blah. So I start looking like,
what's going on?
Sense of responsibility. But also the other aspect of it, I'm like, wait, we've gotten to a point where we devalue connectedness, and then we don't really understand why to some degree we're exhausted and we're burnt out in terms of looking at what our meaning in life and our existence, so to speak, is. So it really does affect just a lot of our areas of life, because I don't see how anyone can fully have a functional, healthy, valuable life where they don't necessarily have existing, healthy, secure relationships that are giving them meaning in the first place. And I not say relationships is everything, but it's a big part.
Thank you for sharing that. And I was thinking about what you were saying, and I was just kind of adding one and one together. And I was like, and you know, this also leads to questioning who you are. So then that becomes a whole thing about like your identity and self-perception, especially if you're living your life according to societal expectations and not who you authentically are as a person, because it creates this inner conflict. You're going back and forth with yourself like, oh, this does it, because you don't really know, like there's confusion about your values or your goals, and you know, that's when it creates like this identity crisis, and then self-doubt, and then low self-esteem and feeling. But that also pushes you further away from people, further away from connecting from people, because you don't want people to see you for what you're going through at that moment, right? Like if I stay away from people will not really know this. If I put up an identity that's not like how I'm truly feeling internally, then, you know, maybe I'll be able to connect with people, but then it's not real. It doesn't last long. It's very temporary. But then again, like you were saying, there's going to be a lot of like regret or like mistakes made in relationships that also makes people isolate you. And going through all of that can obviously create you being detached from yourself, the world, and like just other people in general. So
absolutely. And like you really make an excellent point in when you bring that up. And it even makes me also just think about, well, it comes back again to this notion of social media where it's hard to feel as though you can relate to someone who's presenting their life as though it is, let's say there is success, happiness, joy. And let me put it this way, actually, it's hard to relate with people whose life look like it's perfect to some degree. It's stable.
They got everything.
It's healthy. It's functional. And where that miscommunication, or I guess where it gets misconstrued, is the fact that the foundation of what social media is for you to present that way
Right.
to a large degree.
Right.
It's the same way in which now news to some degree is literally manipulated for the consumers
Right.
to reach the
Agreed.
consumer in a way in which it's supposed to reach the consumer. So it's almost as though it's put together like a nice, in a nice package to reach whoever it is it needs to reach, who might already be feeling like they're isolated
Right.
or fear of missing out,
Yeah.
or who might already be dissatisfied with their life and they're just scrolling
Yeah.
and scrolling.
Yeah.
And I think where, unfortunately, it can be very, very tricky as well is that when I think about social media, I don't necessarily think about a realistic view of the world. I think about a romanticized view of our world.
Period. That's a healthy
So
way of
if
viewing
we're
it.
now, so if we're now sort of comparing ourselves or working towards a romanticized view of what we think happiness might look like or our world should look like, and not actually living in the reality of what our world is, of what happiness means, of what success means.
Right.
It's almost as though you're chasing something that the goalpost keeps moving.
Yeah.
And you're like, I'm moving, I'm chasing this thing again. I'm comparing it to this thing. And then, of course, the goalpost moves again and they're exhausted.
Yeah.
I'm comparing again and they're exhausted. And you're sort of wondering why you're never really satisfied or you're always feeling exhausted.
Yeah.
And because it's just so accessible, it makes it even more difficult for us to be able to be present in our day-to-day lives and needs.
Agreed.
In really being able to navigate, for me specifically, what does happiness mean? What does joy mean? What does having a good job or a stable lifestyle look like?
Right.
What does mental health and wellness look like for me?
Right.
And how can I achieve that specific to me and my own needs?
Right. Wow. Yeah. It takes away the present. And like we were saying earlier, like the effort that you may be putting in or just how much you're working hard to achieve those goals or those little things that you're doing to get to the future that you actually have a goal of creating. It takes that away from you because social media is creating this romanticized, like Paula said's version. But before we moved on, because I kind of want to talk about the spiritual aspect of how existential burnout may show up, because this is something that I see in a lot of my clients that present with like grief or loss, or just like if you come from an extremely religious family or those different contexts. I kind of wanted us to talk about how you could experience this spiritual disconnection. You can experience this spiritual disconnection and, you know, you're just trying to find meaning of, is there a God? Is there not a God? And you kind of have like this crisis of your faith. And I think a lot of times in my experience with my clients, people are just like, well, I'm just going to disengage from spirituality or religion in general. But when we get to kind of explore a little bit more and process where that's coming from, it just comes with like, you know, when they say with God, you kind of have to let things be. Like you can't have all the answers. And I think a lot of times as human beings, we want
all the answers.
Yeah. So it always comes from there. And especially with like science and so many things going on, I think a lot of people struggle with just not knowing, if that makes sense. Like they just struggle with not knowing. It's like, how can I just leave it to this one being up there? But I also think moving away from science and that, like just with loss, like just asking those questions of like, why did this happen to me? Why did I lose this person that, you know, brings me so much joy, happiness, whether it's your parents, your siblings, your friend, and just questioning like your view of what your relationship with this spiritual being looks like. I think it's a big part of existential burnout. Like there's a lot of people that I've worked with that just decided, because they're just so burnt out for thinking about it and just like, I'm just disconnecting from life. But like what you were saying earlier, you know, it takes away all the things that they are experiencing in the present that are positive experiences and like things that they're doing. And, you know, it can be very, 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 what's the word I'm looking for? It's very, very interesting to observe because you just know that it's that just that bigger meaning and like just looking for a purpose after you've experienced this very big event in your life.
Yeah. It's a very important thing that you're bringing up as well. And I think sometimes we sort of look at spirituality and religion as the same thing, even though they can be
connected.
What's the word? They can be interconnected. They can, in that sense of obviously belief, finding comfort, some level of ethics that follows spirituality and religion, some level of having to also deeply reflect. And obviously, I understand that everyone has different religious practices, even spiritual practices too as well.
Yeah.
I personally identify as a Christian and identify as someone who, I guess, a follower of Christ, if you want to put it that way, but not necessarily because I adhere to the structural organizational aspects of religion or Christianity, religion, or whatever you want to call it, but more so based off my own personal, intimate relationship with God that can either be manifested through being of service to other people in my work as a therapist, being of service to my community by volunteering at shelters to help clean up and work with kids and whatnot, being of service to my family, being of service to my friends, being of service to my partner, being of service to my niece, whoever, so to speak. But then also can come from a perspective as well of me finding meaning in what it means for me to be here. And I think to a large degree, because things like spirituality require you to actually find meaning, right? Like to find meaning and to connect on a deeper level than what you just see, what we see on a day-to-day basis on the surface level. It also requires us to have to be intentional. It also requires us to have to put in a little bit of effort. It also requires us to have to be vulnerable. And I think to a large degree, because I hate to say, but us as human beings, we can be mentally lazy.
I mean, it requires effort.
I don't know why I whispered that.
Because it's true. It's true.
We can be mentally lazy in the sense where we want, like you said, we want what we want when we want it. We want to know why, because if we know why, knowing why as well gives us some level of peace and gives us some level of meaning. And I think why the point that you made rather about sometimes not everything needs to be questioned is very, very true. And I think sometimes we also have, going back to this idealistic / romanticized view as well of the world, we also have idealistic and romanticized view of spirituality and whatnot. And it can be as simple as practice of mindfulness. It can be as simple as practicing through reading, like spirituality through reading and educating yourself. It can be spirituality through going for a run, being out in nature. I have a friend of mine who took, I guess, and I want to make sure I'm remembering this correctly, but I think spent a few years of her life and just finally stopped doing it got an RV and sort of rode around the whole country.
Oh, wow. Look at that.
And would be in San Diego, would be here, would be somewhere else, would be whatnot.
I love it.
And I think a big part, and I've not fully asked her this, and I probably need to, because I know to a great degree, she was searching for meaning, following loss. And she was really trying to maybe connect. And my own understanding of why she was navigating this too as well was to be able to connect beyond what it is that she knows, but then also what it is she has lost. And for something like that, now that can sound grand for someone else. It doesn't have to necessarily be that. But to a large degree, when we have like an idea of what we think certain things are, we want to fit that narrative. We want to fit that narrative of spirituality. Spirituality in itself can also just mean, to some degree, friendship. So it's really your own
definition.
How to put this? It's your own definition and your own view of what that is. But I agree with you, because I don't joke about my relationship with God, because it gives me purpose, meaning, it gives me peace, it gives me comfort, it helps me hold myself accountable. It helps me reflect on my actions. And I'm not saying that everyone
has to
necessarily has to follow that level of practice of religion and spirituality. But finding what works for you, as long as it helps you be someone you're proud of. So put it this way, as long as it's not harmful, as long as it's not hurting people, but it's more so allowing you to see the humanity in yourself and the humanity in other people. It takes you out of just the day-to-day combustion of what it means to be existentially exhausted. And actually finding something that you can easily work through, so to speak.
Thank you so much for saying that, because it's you being intentional, not what your parents have told you, not what you've learned from school or what you saw on the internet. It's what you are being intentional about with your humanity, like Paula says. So thank you.
Absolutely. And I have a question for you.
Oh God. Okay, go ahead.
When someone actually recognizes that they are facing existential burnout, which to some degree, some people might be listening and being like, oh, I think I might be existentially burnt out and I just thought that it was this instead.
Right.
But when someone recognizes that they're facing existential burnout, what approaches or strategies can they actually start considering to help them navigate through it and to find meaning again for themselves?
I think you kind of already touched on that question a little bit when you said mindfulness. And I think that would be connected with just self-reflecting and becoming aware. I think practicing, before you practice mindfulness, I do think journaling, self-reflecting, writing about some of these thoughts or feelings or experiences that you're having can help you make connections, but it also gives yourself the space to have those intentional, deeper existential questions and like answering those questions for yourself. But I also think engaging in mindfulness can help you focus on the present, the things that you're doing now, but also become aware of your thoughts, feelings, like where are those thoughts coming from, right? If we're talking about meaning, if I'm being present, where are those things or those thoughts or feelings coming from? Is it that I'm not feeling confident in my relationships? Is it that I'm not feeling confident in my spirituality? Is it that I'm not feeling confident at my workplace? Like whatever it is, right? But you can't answer those questions if you're not present and intentionally taking that step to sit with those thoughts and those feelings. But as we always say in every episode, please seek professional help. I feel like that's always like at the end of our episode, talk to a therapist, because I do think therapy provides this safe and, as Paula says, brave space for us to explore our feelings in a way that's very non-judgmental. Like a therapist will sit with some of the thoughts I've heard and I'm like, I know that like it's very brave of them to say that to me, because wow, like I know in like your normal daily life, people may look at you crazy, like, what are you talking about, right? But that's the essence of therapy or counseling, because they give you this safe space to explore these thoughts. And we actually have existential therapy, if you don't know, developed by Arvin Yalom, if I say his name correctly. And so there are approaches to actually exploring meaning, purpose, and identity. And this may be very beneficial if you sit with a therapist that practices that approach in their work. And I think I will also add connecting with your values and your goals, and not the ones that social media is telling you to connect with. Like, what are your real values? What are your real goals? What are your who are you as a person, can help you feel more authentic and feel like you're living a more meaningful life. And I know that social media is it can be like a bait, right? Like you could create that and then you take the bait. You just go on Instagram one day and then you see something and like, oh my God, whatever. But that's why therapy would help you, because it brings you back to the present again, that yes, those things are there, but they may not be a true reflection of you as a human being and your own life. What about you, Paula? What do you think?
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. And just to quickly add to that, Ivan Yalom is an existential psychiatrist, I guess, who wrote a book called Existential Psychotherapy and does practice a lot of existential psychotherapy. And apparently the founder of Existential Psychotherapy is someone called Rollo May, and to some degree was a big inspiration of Yalom. Yalom kind of took it and made it what it is today, so to speak. Love me some Yalom.
I know. He actually wrote a book, now that I forget. I'm going to have to Google it. But
is it the existential therapy? No, psychotherapy one, or a different one?
It's like I think it's a therapy one. I'm going to try and remember.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's the one, The Gift of Therapy. Is very beautiful, I think. Yeah,
that book.
It's a very beautiful book. I don't even think you need to be a therapist to read that book.
No, you don't. Because he really does highlight why in the first place psychotherapy actually helps with existential growth and awareness. but then also why it's obviously very necessary and helpful in the first place. And I think you touched on so many different points, but also the truth really from exactly what you said, that seeking help, because it goes back to that community thing and the notion of it's me and me alone and up to me to be able to figure out what it is that's going on with me. And then you ask the question of, but is that working? And has it been working? No, it has not necessarily been working for you. So to a large degree, I would say that we actually need to start to understand that asking for help and seeking the right help, especially when we actually have accessibility.
Yes.
Well, in most cases, we have accessibility to these resources is very necessary.
Agreed.
But even if, let's say, therapy is not an option and is not necessarily something that's accessible to yourself, I even think, going back to what you said mindfulness, you said some other things already. But then I even think just developing a habit of self-compassion goes a very long way. I was telling a client of mine yesterday that the time and the effort that they take into really understanding their friends, understanding their partner, being able to build an intimate relationship with their partner, with their friends, being able to anticipate their needs, that's the same level or even more the type of effort and time that needs to be spent in being able to really get to know yourself.
Agreed.
As well. And to a large degree, the more you actually know yourself and develop that level of self-intimacy of what works for you and what doesn't work for you, the more you're going to be better able to actually help heal yourself, so to speak. And I'm not saying in that way of like, I'm healing myself by myself. No, we're saying with the help of a therapist, with the help of friends, with the help of community, with the help of educating yourself as well, being able to expose one's knowledge and mind to not just what is being accessible to you, but starting to filter the information you're absorbing a lot more positive, a lot more uplifting, a lot more I guess motivating work that forces you to have to really look at your life and look at the things that you need to change. You start seeing that your perspective as well, even of existential burnout or even just other things in life as well, begins to change. And as we're wrapping up this conversation, can existential burnout lead to us questioning deeper aspects of our life? Such as our belief systems or our spirituality. But I'll put it this way. Do you think it can impact our sense of purpose or connection to something larger than ourselves?
Absolutely. I think we kind of touched on that because I think as human beings, we always want answers. We always want like we always want to connect with something bigger than ourselves. I think in my experience, that's what I've seen. So I think, absolutely. I think people may find some level of validation from connecting with something that's bigger. So like that's where you see like people connecting with God or like religion or whatever. But like what Paula was saying, it's more about your relationship with God, not what society has created that it must be. You know, you have to be intentional with what that looks like. And it may not look like the traditional relationship people have. Because I think sometimes on social media, people be like, oh, that's not ideal because I identify as a Muslim. That's not ideal of a good Muslim. That's not ideal of a Muslim or a Christian or whatever. But I'm like, but you don't know what in private me and what my conversations with God look like. You don't know what my interactions with God look like. You don't know what I've built in terms of being intentional of what that identity I identify with looks like, right? So
absolutely,
kind of just focusing on your own journey, focusing on, you know, what's meaningful to you, focusing on what you want your purpose to look like, focusing on what you want your goals to look like, and kind of wrapping it up that way.
Absolutely. And to even wrap that up too as well, I'm going to recommend a documentary I watched very recently. It's called Heal. Heal. That is literally what it's called. It's on Amazon Prime. I watch it on Amazon Prime and I'm going to keep watching it till it's stuck in my brain. And I think that it's very helpful in which it helps you start to understand how we think. How we think really influences what we do, how we navigate our lives, but then also what we put into our bodies, whether mind, from a mind, body, soul perspective.
Right.
And one of the references that they made in the documentary, and I'll just read that off really quick. It's called Radical Remission. Now, it's a book by a psychotherapist that specializes in integrative oncology.
Right. Oh.
So it's more for obviously oncology. However, a lot of what they talked about in the book was really that the way our belief systems around existence. And she puts 9 common factors and things that we actually can start to address in our lives that can really help.
Right.
One of it was changing your diet, taking control of your health, starting to follow your intuition, using herbs and supplements, whether it's figuring out what might work for you. Obviously, speak to your providers before you use anything.
Agreed.
Releasing suppressed emotions, therapy, increasing positive emotions, embracing social support, deepening your spiritual connection, and having strong reasons for living.
Heavy. But those are very accurate. Yep. We'll just leave it like that. What a way to end the season. Look at us. I'm gonna have to reflect a little bit and have some existential questions myself after this.
Okay, as we're rounding up, one feeling word to describe
this is hard.
What season 1 has been, and then one description of what to expect.
One feeling
for
word.
Season 2.
Feeling word. Dang. I would say feeling. I'm gonna go with optimism. Like there's always light at the end of the tunnel with all the knowledge and just the things that even I've learned from having conversations with you. I think I'm gonna optimism. And then what was the second question?
I love that. And then what should people expect? Just one brief description of what should people expect for season 2.
We're back. I know you're gonna miss us, so we're gonna be back with even more content, more knowledge, everything season 1 gave, but even better. What about you?
Can I reframe that?
Yes.
And just because that's exactly what I was going to say. See, we're in sync. I'll put it this way: expect abundance.
Period. Exactly.
In season 2. Whereas my feeling word is just gratitude overall.
Yes.
I think this has been such a great experience working with you, working
Always
with
a
our producer Kyra, and working with our engineer as well, Inem.
Shout out to you guys again. And as always, shout out to our listeners. We would always like to hear your thoughts, feelings, feedback. So Paula, you get the honors of doing the finale where they can find us for season 1.
All right, so you can find us via email at info@dwhyapodcast.com. You can find us on Instagram at DWHYA Podcast. You can find us on Twitter, now known as X, at DWHYA Podcast.
Love it.
You can find us on TikTok at DWHYA Podcast 1.
Excellent job. We love you guys, and we will see you.
We love you too.
In the next season. Bye.
Until then, bye.
Bye. Mic drop.